Hey everybody, this is a piece, an appendix from a section of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, and it's by Sean Matgamna. And it's titled, The Strange Case of the Militant and the USSR in the First 18 Months of War. Editor's note, the editor being Sean Matgamna. It would seem obvious that there must be a straight line of direct continuity between the passionate polemics in 1939 to 40 about, quote, defending the Soviet Union and the record of, quote, official Trotskyism for the next 50 years. The files of the American Trotskyist papers, the Socialist Appeal and the Militant, tell a surprisingly different story. There is, during the war before Russian victory at Stalingrad, the year when the USSR seemed about to go down before the German onslaught, something like a break in continuity. In late 1941, the Socialist Workers' Party, so the coverage in the Militant suggests, decided that the USSR was as good as done for. Anticipating it, they removed, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, from the prominence it had had in this militant since June 1941, when the Nazis invaded, and dropped the quotation from Trotsky, which had appeared every week, insisting that the USSR was the, quote, fortress of the world proletariat, end quote. Through most of 1942, the Militant, remaining, quote, defensist, was fairly low-key and muted on the issue, though they still occasionally referred to Stalin's army as, quote, Trotsky's Red Army. See the strange keynote cartoon from August 4, 1942 on page 410. It was only after the tide turned at Stalingrad late in 1942 that the militant, quote, came back on board, end quote. Passion and order appeared in their, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. People who joined the communist parties then were known as the, quote, Stalingrad draft, end quote. This was, quote, Trotskyism's, end quote, Stalingrad draft. The facts are as follows. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. The Militant responded 28th of June 1941 with a front-page manifesto calling on workers to defend the Soviet Union at all costs and under all circumstances against imperialist attack. I don't know if I said the quote at the beginning of that, but it was a quote. Quote, defend the Soviet Union at all costs and under all circumstances against imperialist attack. Although the German armies quickly conquered large areas, the Militant claimed that, quote, Red Army morale astonishes its enemies, ... Soviet soldiers fight bravely because they have something worth defending, end quote. 9th of August 1941. The vigor of the Red Army was traced back to the work of Trotsky in establishing it and leading it in the Civil War. Quote, Trotsky organized the Red Army, end quote. 16th of August 1941, and repeated pictures of Trotsky in military uniform. From the 9th of August 1941, the editorial page carried a quotation from Trotsky, incongruously from 1931. Quote, to defend the Soviet Union as the main fortress of the world revolution against all assaults of world imperialism and of internal counter-revolution is the most important duty of every class-conscious worker, end quote. It's important to note that in 1931, Trotsky was still viewing the left opposition as an opposition, right? There wasn't talk of, I don't believe that there was a talk about forming a Fourth International or Trotskyism or like the the Trotskyist movement or the Bolshevik-Leninist movement being a counter-movement to Stalinism until the fall of Germany to Hitler in 1933. I think that's when serious talk about creating a new international to counter the Comintern really became a serious political idea for Trotsky or the Trotskyist movement. So it would appear that Trotsky moved to the idea of there being a political revolution in the USSR later than 1931, and had a more increasingly seemed to appear to have, like, despite its contradictions, have an increasingly more critical attitude of the Soviet Union up until his death. Back to the text. The Militant advertised a pamphlet with a selection of Trotsky's writings between 1927 and 1937 entitled In Defense of the Soviet Union. I have a lot of the pieces from that channel, from that book on the channel, which is basically more or less no, sorry, that's not sorry, I thought it was In Defense of Marxism. Sorry, I'm fucking losing my shit. The Militant advertised a pamphlet with a selection of Trotsky's writings between 1927 and 1937, entitled In Defense of the Soviet Union. Stalin's propaganda pictures were sometimes used with uncritical captions. Quote, Soviet collective farmers do their bit in defense of the Soviet Union by bringing in their harvest, ... end quote. 20th September 1941. The paper did carry criticism of Stalinism, as the German armies moved up to Leningrad, September 1941, and Moscow, October 1941. The Militant carried a front page led by Natalia Sedova Trotsky. Quote, Catastrophe faces the USSR as a result of Stalin's rule. Stalin's purges beheaded the Red Army, end quote. 4th of October 1941. The USSR regained a small amount of territory in a counteroffensive in December 1941 to January 1942, but was then driven back again by a new German offensive in summer 1942. During this period, while the USSR's position seemed almost hopeless, the Militant did not renounce defense of the USSR, but gave it a very much lower profile. I'm going to repeat that because it's in italics. During this period, while the USSR's position seemed almost hopeless, the Militant did not renounce defense of the USSR, but gave it a very much lower profile. On the 17th of January 1942, the quotation from Trotsky on defending the USSR was removed from the top of the editorial page. It did not reappear until the Russian armies were rolling back the German forces at Stalingrad. On the 5th of December 1942, the Militant had for the first time added a new point 9 to the 8-point policy statement it carried every week on its editorial page. Quote, defend the Soviet Union against imperialist attack, end quote. On the 19th of December 1942, the 1931 quotation, now with a portrait of Trotsky, reappeared on the editorial page. As the USSR's military successes continued, and right up to the 31st of March 1945, while the Stalinist army was advancing through Eastern Europe, the Militant continued to carry the quotation and the policy point. The Socialist Workers' Party published In Defense of Marxism, a heavily one-sided selection of Trotsky's writings about the Soviet Union, in mid-December 1942. I would say that the book is a very reactionary book. It's a book of just kind of like, in my opinion, at least, others may agree, but very just kind of like vitriolic, like sloppy, defamatory writings of Trotsky against the minority position in the Socialist Workers' Party. Like I said, it's like Matgamna is saying here, it's heavily one-sided. But if you read the book, it's just kind of like a lot of it's kind of denigrating the minority on the basis of its of like kind of like sociological criteria, right? About like it not being, the members not being like substantially proletarian or something like that, as opposed to the Canon faction, which essentially was like really proletarian, and it's kind of like characterized the minority as a bunch of just kind of like, I don't know, abstract know-it-all intellectuals concentrated in the Bronx, basically. If you read what's it? I can't remember the fucking name, but is it Constance Ashton? I don't know. It's from the Prophet's Army. What the hell is that book? Oh, alright. So, if you read the section on the debate, The Prophet's Army, Trotskyist in America, 1928 to 1941, by Constance Ashton Myers, she straight calls Trotsky's discourse anti-Semitic, on the grounds of its kind of like It's I guess it's kind of like anti-urban, anti-metropolitan, like intellectual kind of like tone, I guess, of like of these, like, I don't know, like, I can't really explain her argument for doing that, but she definitely uses those words. So if you're interested in like the tone of this debate, I would check out that piece by that I have on this channel by Constance Ashton Myers, from the book The Prophet's Army, Trotskyist America, 1928 to 1941. Anyway. The references to Trotsky as the creator of the Red Army, and to quote Trotsky's Red Army, would be a staple propaganda item for the rest of the year. The Socialist Workers' Party remained critical of, quote, Stalinism. They organized a protest meeting when 2 Polish Jewish socialists were murdered by the Stalinist regime. The Militant, 13th of March 1943. But the emphasis remained tilted heavily toward defense and glorification of the USSR, as if the social system there and the, quote, Red Army were things separate from the Stalinist rulers. In 1944, Natalia Sedova Trotsky began to protest at the heavily pro-Russian line of the Militant. A decision was made in late 1944 to replace the regular Trotskyist quotation with another. It would be March 31st, 1945, when the Stalinist armies already controlled Eastern Europe and a large part of Germany, a few weeks short of the end of the war in Europe, before the 1931 quotation from Trotsky was replaced by another, quote, only the World Revolution can save the USSR for socialism, but the World Revolution carries with it the inescapable blotting out of the Kremlin oligarchy, end quote. The policy point remained. An editorial explained, quote, whereas in the preceding period we correctly subordinated the struggle for the overthrow of the Stalinist regime to the needs of military defense, it's now imperative to subordinate everything else to the defense of the advancing European Revolution, end quote. So that's the piece by Matgamna. And then there's a series of clippings in the book from various publications, the Socialist Appeal and the Militant of the Socialist Workers' Party, the mainstream, the majority Trotskyist party in the United States, that emerged from the split between the minority and the majority in the Socialist Workers' Party. The Socialist Workers' Party continuing representing Orthodox Trotskyism, and then the Workers' Party under Shachtman's leadership representing a third camp Trotskyist position, which abandoned the degenerated worker state thesis and embraced a bureaucratic collectivism thesis on the USSR. But in this, what I'm talking about right now is that there's clippings from the Socialist Workers' Party post-split publication. It gives a description of some of them. The early months, big headlines backing the USSR, claims that, quote, Soviet soldiers fight bravely because there's something worth defending, end quote. One of the images is from September 26, 1941. The Western Stalinists, after June 1941, used to ask the rhetorical question, why, in contrast to France in 1940, was there no pro-Nazi fifth column in the USSR? And answered, because Stalin shot them all. This was retrospective justification for the Moscow trials. Incongruously, Militant gets in on the act with its own gloss. In Leningrad, the workers rule, ... In point of historical fact, over 90,000 members of the, quote, Red Army defected and fought on the German side. Their leader, Vlasov, vainly tried to steer an independent course, like Poland's Pilsudski in World War I, between Russia and Germany. and that's referring to, according to Wikipedia, that refers to Andrei Vlasov. Andrei Vlasov lived from 1901 to 1946 and was a Soviet Red Army general and collaborator with Germany. During the Axis Soviet campaigns of World War II, he fought 1941 to 1942 against the Wehrmacht in the Battle of Moscow, and later was captured attempting to lift the siege of Leningrad. After his capture, he defected to Germany and headed the Russian Liberation Army. Initially, this army existed only on paper and was used by Germans to goad Red Army troops to surrender. Only in 1944 did Heinrich Himmler, aware of Germany's shortage of manpower, arrange for Vlasov to form a real collaborationist army formed from Soviet prisoners of war. At the war's end, Vlasov changed sides again and ordered the ROA to aid the May 1945 Prague uprising against the Germans. He and the ROA then tried to escape to the Western Front, but were captured by Soviet forces with the United States assistance. Vlasov was tortured, tried for treason, and hanged. So, back to the text. More clippings. And these pieces are from late 1941 to late 1942. The USSR seemed doomed and never more needed defense. One of the pieces from October 18th, 1941. But from January to December 1942, the quotation from Trotsky about the defense of the USSR is dropped. In reference to one of the pieces, December 1942, as the Stalinist army takes the offensive, the quotation reappears with a new point in the paper's policy platform. There's more clippings. The paper's cartoons by Laura Gray were consistently anti-Stalinist. This one appeared on March 17th, 1945, while the paper was still carrying the Trotskyist quote about defense of and the quote defend the defend the USSR policy. Okay, so that's the end of the clippings. I know that was kind of an awkward video because I'm reading like captions for images that can't be seen, but I think there's still something to be got out of from listening to this recording. Hopefully you agree. Thank you.